What would you like to see change in your life? And what is the biggest obstacle that you're facing now? I run a 5-week program at the Inner Knowing School for serious individuals who are ready to take the next step in their personal and professional lives. I will personally be coaching a small group of individuals, a number of practical tools and frameworks for creating an intuition practice and for self mastery. You can find more at theinnerknowingschool.com. I have a master's certification in intuition medicine, and I've condensed 10 plus years of experience and research navigating how to harness your energy and intuition in an easy to access live curated course. Now, as someone who's helped countless creatives, entrepreneurs, and many who are just plain stuck, open doors of possibility they never thought existed, I've seen this strategy transform people's inner states and external reality. And the best part is that you'll skyrocket your output and unlock your creative genius. I'll work with you weekly live to overcome your limiting beliefs and show you how to manage your energy instead of your time. I'll teach you how to create clarity, processes, develop your intuition based on some of the top tools and frameworks that I've developed. And you'll get access to guided meditations and visualizations not available anywhere else. This method is so effective that even if you don't have that much time, or if you think that you might not be ready, this will work for you. You can check out the link in the show notes to join the waiting list, and you can check out what past clients had to say about the program. Wishing you all many blessings ahead. Hi, my name is Yasmin Tarehi, and this is Gateways to Awakening, where we host one-on-one conversations with leading experts in wellness, well-being, and spirituality. On today's episode, I sit down with Amanda Nagai. She's a storyteller, an artist, and a designer, former tech world startup founder and engineer, who these days geeks out on her inner world, grief, the collective awareness, ritual, and poetry. She's also the author of Walk Us Home, a memoir told through poetry and art, which was released in 2024, and proceeds from the book will support You're Going to Die's suicide prevention and community catharsis work inside San Quentin Rehabilitation Center, formerly the San Quentin State Prison. And after years of big personal loss, illness, and all the healing and inner exploration modality workshops and trainings, she has some quiet understandings of what we lack as a society, what we need, and the limits of her own personal comprehension in the face of mystery. I am so delighted to welcome Amanda to the show, and I recently heard her talk at the Ignite Talks in San Francisco and was really moved by what she shared. So welcome to the show, Amanda.
Thank you so much, Yasmin.
So Amanda, to kick it off, what does it mean exactly to grieve?
The simple question. Let's start easy. I will just start by saying that I'm definitely a student of grief. I think many of us are. Should we be open to that? So I don't claim to have the answers. Student of grief and student of mystery. I would say that, traditions around the world, all peoples have different stories around grief, but they all usually have practices around grieving, and usually communal practices. And so I am studying the works and with some of the students of Malidoma and Subonfu Somé and Martine Prechtel, and of the Tutihil Mayan people and the Dogra people before for the Somés. And they have many things to say about grief. And so the Somés talk about it being a soul cleansing. It's a way that we stay safe and sane and recover from losses and weave into community the story of that life and death and passing and with the ancestors. And Martine Prechtel and the Tutihil Mayan lineage will speak about grief and praise being aspects of the same thing, and that grief is praise for what we love. So there's many ways to look at, he emphasizes that we need the dead need our tears and our wails. Um, and it's for them becoming ancestors and part of their journey as much as, the Subonfo Somé talking about the soul cleansing for us who are still living here on this plane. So there's many angles and ways to look at grief. For me, grief has really been as much as it was a dissolving, like explosive, or has been, and especially in this last grief that this book that you referenced of mine that just came out, Walk Us Home, was this big explosive, dissolving, tearing apart experience. It was also, when I look back at it, sort of like a guiding light. It was a guiding light back to my body and my soul and what matters. But to get there and to be able to see it that way, I had to follow it into the depths of wherever it wanted to take me. Yeah, go for it. I'm talking.
Yeah, no, this is so, I feel like every word you're uttering is like just poetry to my own soul. And I just want to, I want to talk about a couple things that you mentioned, because I think for the audience, I think grief, first of all, is a subject that most people don't talk about. We certainly don't celebrate it. And we sort of kind of push it to the periphery of our lives. Like even when it comes to things like death and illness, like, we sort of treat it almost like it's a disease that we can catch as opposed to just a natural process in life. And, you spoke about grief being in some traditional cultures really a communal practice. And it feels like these days, especially, coming out of the pandemic, it felt like, wow, our grief and also death has been very much isolated. And so I wanted to talk to you about that, your experience of grief in community, and and maybe sharing helpful practices for people who are grieving, who may need the support of a community, and what to do next.
Yeah. I hear you so much in speaking about how isolated we are in our grief, especially in the pandemic and coming out of the pandemic. But I would say it's much longer than that. You know, we all, if you trace us back long enough, we all come from an indigenous culture, wherever that came from, or several, depending at this point in our histories. I come from many different lineages, as most of us do, and in those cultures, we had practices that helped us to. Grief is very embodied. I say in the talk, the Ignite talk that you came to, that grief is a wound of the animal soul, and that is. I feel that so deeply because I've seen it growl. I've seen it uh, in shame, in joy, in orgasm, in anger. I've seen grief express itself with many faces and voices in myself and those around me. Um, and so this is very much an embodied thing it's an energy that needs to move, is how I understand it. And so, and when we do that, when we create containers with other people, it creates a space. It helps to hold the container for that energy to move. And most of, like I was referencing indigenous cultures, like they had practices to create those spaces together. And now here we are in a more modern society where a lot of us have lost touch with our indigenous practices, or those indigenous practices have been pulled through different frameworks, Western frameworks, other types of religious, other frameworks that can sometimes strip away some of those important pieces that help us to hold those very sacred containers. And I think there's a longing in us. And so in my talk and in my book, it all stems from a personal grief that I had. The person I was dating, and I've had other griefs before this, but this was the one that really shattered me a couple years ago. The person I was dating, suddenly, I lost him suddenly due to suicide. And I was with him up until the moment I left him in his car. And I didn't realize what was going on in his head. And I was supposed to see him a couple of hours later, and I never saw him again. Um, And the community in the wake of that, yeah, when the emotion comes up, I just let it. So I hope your audience can roll with me as well.
Of course.
So in the wake of that, um, his community was torn apart. Nobody thought he was going to do something like this, and we had so many questions, and we had so much emotion, and we had so much raw and animalistic energy that needed to be expressed to each other, that needed to be expressed to ourselves, and in whatever cosmology you believe, maybe needed to be expressed to him and to our ancestors. Um, and so we started to form, some of us in small circles, these little sacred containers to be able to open these energies within a circle of each other, holding space for this and really being able to fully express what was in there. People were punching pillows, people were pounding floors, people were wailing and screaming. It was actually incredibly beautiful. It was heartbreakingly, gut-wrenchingly gorgeous. I just remember sitting there thinking, wow, like I've never been to a movie that was scripted better than this. It was just so captivating. At the same time as it was not a movie, it was my life. you know. But so there's a lot of beauty in grief, or can be, and so I am student of of lineages, that I am still learning, but I feel very called to advocate for finding these spaces and finding these lineages that can hold us, because grief can also be a gift in the way that we communally connect and hold each other. But so often grief becomes a personal thing and maybe even a shame and something that we don't think other people can hold, or maybe they've told us they can't hold it. And so it can actually become divisive and like an extra pain on top of the pain that is already there.
Mm. Wow. Amanda, thank you so much for sharing that, really touching, moving experience. And, want to double click on this experience where you said that, you gathered with the community to process this grief, and there was, screaming and wailing and punching and, I think allowing yourself to have that space and in a community to be able to express yourself is so powerful. I think about, so I am Middle Eastern, and it's very customary for a lot of really bold, loud expression to come out during
Mm.
funerals or
Mhm.
during moments of grief. There's just, I think if you Google like Middle Eastern mom grieving, there's like no holds bar, like there's just
Yeah.
screaming. And it's interesting because I think that in our Western culture, I feel like, especially in certain, places, feels like we're sort of taught to not to show that side of ourselves, or to process it, or to be strong, and so it's really refreshing to hear this story. And I'm, wondering, like, for those maybe who have gone through an experience of deep grief and haven't had that experience, what do you suggest that they go, do? And how would you advocate for
Mm.
them?
Hmm. Um, wow. Well, I think that, I mean, we all have grief. That's the thing about, um, that I don't think that we acknowledge it as much in the society. Now there's like disorders where we say people who are grieving too long have a specific disorder name to it. What is too long? What is grief? I think that's because we have a fundamental um, misunderstand or just lack of understanding of what grief really is. And so we just have this fear of emotionality, the strong emotionality in public spaces, especially in private as well, but definitely in public. Um, but there are many types of grief. So even if you have not lost a very close loved one to death, you have probably lost a job or a house or a relationship, right? There are many griefs, and you may have also um, be carrying griefs from your ancestors, right? Whether you call that epigenetics or you have a more spiritual understanding of it, we all carry griefs at this point in our society with the layers of history and trauma that we have. Um, there are many griefs in each of our bodies, is my belief. And I just sort of come back to what Sibonfu Sume said about like grief is a soul cleansing. And she said specifically to stay safe and sane and recover from
Mm.
losses. And I mean, you don't have to be really paying too hard of attention to see how insane our world is right now. And I do believe a lot of that is because we are not clearing our grief. I mean, all types of emotions, but because grief is really my lens right now, I'm just seeing it everywhere. And grief that is unacknowledged, you know, anger, all kinds of things can cover up grief, because grief is a emotion and a experience that we are largely afraid of as a society. I have a friend who's um, very wise and helps counsel a lot of people through very, very life-threatening, intense illnesses. And she said to me recently, I felt like I had to cry, but I was afraid if I started crying, I would never stop. And this is somebody who is, very aware of herself and very aware of her emotions. And I've heard that, or I've heard that in unsaid, but in somebody's voice many times. Um, and I think that it makes us afraid to go there. And so we mask it up with other things. We logic it away and tell ourselves stories of why we don't need to grieve, or why we don't deserve to grieve, or why everything's okay. We also cover it up with other emotions, like anger. We pull it further inside maybe, and just, create some numbness because we just can't feel it. Right. Um, and I think that not only is that not healthy for us internally, but it's not healthy for us as a collective. And so when you say, like, for people who haven't grieved, like I said, we all have grief for something. And so how do we help each other create those containers to be able to look at the things that we're feeling? And I think one part that has helped me to start to understand from, I also lost my mother when I was 22. Like, I've had some griefs in my life, and started being educated on them on the earlier side. And what I think I've come to realize, and that I've heard a lot of elders and teachers speak to, is that grief is not a process that has a timeline that ends. That grief is more an initiation that helps you um, find these pieces of yourself and allow things to flow and move, and that you don't heal, quote unquote, from grief. I think that it just becomes part of your larger story. So when I think of my mother in certain contexts, I smile, and in certain contexts, I have a little tear in the corner in my eye, and sometimes I actually really fully cry. And this is how many years later, right? This is not, it's not but she is such a part of my life now, and a part of my memory, and how I chart my way forward. And I would say the same for Peter, who is the name of the person I just was speaking about earlier. And so it's just emotions don't have a start and an end point. They are always, as long as we are alive and we're blessed to be alive, they will weave through our lives. And it's just learning how to be with them, and how to dance with them, and how to give space for them, because sometimes they will crescendo and sometimes they'll sort of be in the background, but they're all just there, and we're just learning how to dance with them.
Right. Right. Wow. So, I was going to ask what the steps are to process grief, and hearing this like, this conversation really is about like the timeline is kind of, it's ever flowing. It doesn't quite
Yeah.
end. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's deeply uncomfortable for most people and in our society. And it's inconvenient for, when do I get back to work? When do I heal? When do I start dating again? All these things. And I just want to invite everyone to, we're all going to experience loss in this life, whether or not we choose to um, like delve into the grief that can come with it. Um, and so we're all facing that, right? Or we've already faced it in the other ways I've mentioned: relationship, housing, all the things. And there's this discomfort when we don't know, when there's not a roadmap, and the roadmap is actually just inside of us. And that's uncomfortable because we don't come with a user manual at the outset.
Right.
It's something we learn over time, right? Um, but you know, in the depths of my grief following Peter, like I was in bed for weeks and months. Like I was barely showering and eating. I was just really having a rough time. But also I was following what it was my body wanted to do, which was it wanted to stay in bed and cry. And it didn't want to do a lot of things that I wanted to do previously because they didn't make sense to me anymore. And I was only going to do the things that I felt compelled to do. Um, and that became very clarifying. And it also was the way that I was able to follow the um, signpost is not the right word, but it's sort of like the little breadcrumbs that my grief was like, okay, we want to go over here. Oh, we want to go spend 5 hours creating these like art projects to hang in trees. Don't know why, but we're going to do that now because it's the only thing I want to do. Um, we want to go sit outside in the sun because it makes us feel alive and it helps us, which, you could also probably say I needed vitamin D, all these other things, who knows? But it was what my body wanted to do. And sometimes it didn't have a clear signal. And the clear signal was just keep sitting here and keep feeling it. And that's still a signal. So for me, and I will have to say I'm a very, very privileged in that I was able to take a lot of time, many, many months, to basically full time grieve, which is not something that most people would want to do or think is even a privileged thing to do. But it is privileged in the sense that I was able to like rely off of savings to do that, because I didn't feel like I had a choice. And I have heard from people who knew that they needed that space and they didn't have the ability, and they wrote in their journals like, I wish I had the time to grieve right now.
Mm,
And it's just heartbreaking to me because that's another thing, another reason why we can't do that. A lot of us can't, outside of the fear and the lack of container and all of that, but also just the society that we live in that doesn't make that space. Um,
right.
yeah.
Wow. So, I love that you talk about this, like creating the space to grieve, because, as mentioned, I think a lot of folks, I noticed this, especially during the pandemic, that there was a lot going on for a lot of people, but folks were just so busy, right? They didn't have the space and time to process emotions. And I think what inevitably happens is that shows up in one way, shape, or form later. And so I think it is, while it is a luxury and maybe a privilege, it's also absolutely necessary for people to go take the time and do what they need to do to
Yeah.
sort of figure out a way to create the space, even if that is in the mornings and in the evenings, but like taking the time to really carve out to process. So, Amanda, you wrote this beautiful book, Walk Us Home, which is really, mostly poetry and kind of it's like storytelling and poetry in such a beautiful way that I haven't seen in a long time. Can you share with us, why you chose to write that book and why you chose that specific title as well?
Mm, thanks. Thank you so much for those kind words. Yeah, well, this book, um, the first 6 weeks after Peter passed, I had been writing. So I wrote poetry as a youth. I yeah, was published and won some contests when I was a high school student, for poetry. But my listening for that, voice in myself from for many decades afterwards was not very loud. So I didn't write a lot of poetry in most of my young adult life. And it wasn't really until the several months before Peter died that I started to find my voice again and was starting to write poetry again. I had actually just sent him. I also some of my poems, and you can see this on my website, are my made into videos, and some of them I like sort of hand. I use the word animate very lightly. It's very like rustic looking, and that was sort of the style I was going for. But like animate some of my poems in a very rustic way, hand drawn way. Um, and I had just sent one of them to him before a couple days before his death, and he sent me back this voice memo of it was basically like a love letter to my poetry and to my voice, and um, and so I was starting to write a lot of more poems, and then he died, and I, everything went silent. Um, from the poetry's perspective, it did not go silent in the rest of my
Mm.
psyche and emotions.
Mm.
Um, And about 6 weeks after he passed, I did a type of ceremony with myself, and I really needed to clear some stuff out of my body and psyche. And luckily, that happened, and it really opened up the gates again. And I started just writing a ton of poems. And the night that I wrote the poem "Walk Us Home," there was a You're Going to Die, which is a local nonprofit in the San Francisco Bay Area. They've been around, I think, 14 or so years. And they work in hospice in San Quentin and a lot of different places now, but they started with the open mic night community grieving space where you can bring sort of anything. A lot of people bring their poetry or song or story about grief and life. But I've seen people read love poems there and other things. It's really just a permissive space. And I brought Walk Us Home the night that I wrote it. I read it at the first You're Going to Die uh, open mic night that they had in person after the pandemic. And when I read that on stage, I was bawling and started choking my way through the poem. Afterwards, somebody came up to me and he essentially said, I've been really having a rough time, and your poem really helped me rethink about what suicide means. And that the following month, at the following open mic night, another person who had been there that first night said something very similar. Like that poem helped me rethink what's suicide, and I don't think I can do it now. And yeah, I mean, I don't know that stuck. I don't know what the long-term impact of that poem was. Um, but having had that experience of hearing that from two different people over the course of 2 months, I just immediately thought, oh, wow, if they could have that experience in the moment, then I need to get this out there somehow.
Mm.
And so I think that seeded the idea that one day this would become a book. But at that point, it was like 8 poems long. So it wasn't really a book yet. And then about 6 months after he passed, I'd been, holed up in my room, crying, staying in bed, doing the thing, but also writing poems. And I felt the need to share back to my community where I had been. And yeah, just my experience. I felt the need for my friends to like witness what I had been going through and what journey I had been on. And I asked Chelsea Coleman, who's the art director of You're Going to Die, who's an amazing singer-songwriter, to help me co-host a night for my friends of reading these poems and interspersing it with her beautiful music. And she said yes. And about 20 of my friends convened and received the first draft of this book orally. And at the end of that gathering, at least several people said that they really wanted that to be published. And Chelsea said, and I think You're Going to Die is going to publish it. And so that's where a lot of this came from. And then along the way, I was like, oh, do I really want to publish some of these poems? They're so vulnerable. It's like my diary. Should I edit them? Should I take them out? But ultimately, I think that we need more like vulnerable, raw sharing so that we can hear each other's stories, and it can help to permission our own and also know that we aren't alone and none of our griefs or experiences are going to be exactly the same. And that was another question mark I had of like, is this just an ego project? Why would I put like, who can see them? Like, how is this helpful to anyone? But when I talk to people who've read these poems, even though my story is not going to be in the details the same as anyone else's, there are themes that really hit home for them as well. And so, to be able to know that we're not alone and to be able to share where we've been and to be able to, like, again, like I was saying, like permission, or I don't really like the word normalize, but to that kind of thing, to permission our own stories and our own journeys. I felt it was important to put it out there. So that's where it came from.
Amazing. Can you actually, if you feel called and comfortable,
Yeah,
I'd love for you to read one of your poems.
sure. Do you have one in mind or?
I felt like there were many that I would read, but I would love for you to
Mm.
pick which one was the most meaningful, and also maybe
Mm,
one that you feel called for this particular experience.
mm. I think maybe I'll just I'll read the title poem,
Okay, great.
which is the one I was just referencing in that story. Mm. Walk us home. Where did you go off that bridge that day? Did you expect that you could fly away? That the inner turmoil, confusion, distress would melt into nothingness and peace and rest? I hope you are in a place of relief and responsibility, that from the beyond, you are now walking us home. Stay with us in the dark nights and in the steady sunlight on tree leaves, in the earned joy of our laughter, born out of deep tear and snot-soaked pain. Stay with us when our bodies convulse, when we cry out your name, when we are angry and curse you, when we beg you desperately to return in a body already mangled and turned to ash. You were holding so much pain, but don't you see? Energy cannot be destroyed. That pain is in us now. All those you love, carrying the shards in our shocked hearts. Your pain shattered and flew from that bridge, finding purchase in soft, beating flesh. We are carrying it now, working to move it, bellow by bellow, shudder by shudder, bowl full of tears by bowl, handkerchiefs that need constant washing, aimless staring eyes, question by question. We will move this pain through, compost it into the ground of our choices, to stay, to live, to be consumed, to repair, to heal, to follow you. because this was always communal work. You thought this pain was yours, singular, your personal nightmare. But you also knew oneness of our inherent connection, that we are never alone, isolated, mere delusion of ego and culture. No pain exists without its echoes in other bodies and its antidotes in other beings. No joy exists without community to hold and nurture it. In your moment of forgetting, you took your body off a great height, but all that you were is not gone. And we are holding you now, doing our work. Make sure you stay and walk us home.
Wow, Amanda. Wow.
Mm.
I'm just so moved listening to that. And what a, I mean, I have no words actually. And I'm like speechless. You embody so much of the story of oneness in this journey of really, it's a journey of forgiveness for a being who is in that space, and also for yourself. That's what it felt like. It was just the remembering of where we come from as this collective. And like you mentioned, we're not these individuals living on this earth and suffering alone. We all suffer together, and we all rise together. So what an important message for this time. I feel like isolation has been an incredibly kind of big theme in our culture today. It feels like, I think I've been reading studies that have been stating that people are reporting less and less close friends in their life, and so we really do need each other more than ever before. So I just want to thank you for writing that. And Amanda, looking back on this journey that you've been on, what has surprised you the most? It could be about human nature or about your own personal experience. Yeah.
Yeah. I think one of the things that has surprised me the most is how surrendering myself so fully to this grief journey, while for a while it made me feel lost and maybe adrift. I don't know what the words are exactly. Ultimately has helped me to find deeper trust in myself than I've ever experienced previous. And I think a lot of that is because I now, I know my own strength, and I know that in the face of the unknown, I can trust myself to just go into whatever is arising, and I won't be lost forever.
Wow.
Yeah.
Mm.
Grief can really be a gift. It's not an easy gift. It's not a gift I would have chosen, but it is a gift we will all receive. So I am just so grateful that this time around with my grief is much different than when I did earlier in my life with my mom. When I started that journey, I mean, not that it finished. And this time, I really feel like I surrendered in a different way, and really had a lot of curiosity and held a lot of space for it. And I feel the better for it.
And, when you've been on this journey, Amanda, I'm curious, who in particular has been inspirational for you, and who's kind of, helped you on this path? Like, was there a person, or did you kind of feel like you your high self was your inspiration.
Yeah. Well, I don't know that I had much of a concept of my highest self at the time. I just felt really, really in it, but I do, a lot of Peter's friends, for instance, are very wise souls themselves. I mean, it's the mixture of the juvenile and the wise all rolled up into one human package. um, and they were very helpful. We were very helpful to each other, I believe, in that way. Um, and and then I have a very close um, sort of like mama figure of mine, and I have some close friends that really came in closer. Grief is also who can show up and who will distance is very becomes very apparent, and I've heard this said many times by people who've had very big griefs in their lives. Um, and you just have to let that roll because some people are uncomfortable, like for the reasons we talked about and in the ways that we've talked about. But the people who came in close are the people that I really could rely on, um, and who, I remember one time where I was really, really struggling, and I messaged my friend that I was really, really struggling, and then she said, come over," and I actually drove to her house, but I was on the phone with a different friend, and so I didn't see when she messaged me, and she got so worried about me not responding that she drove to my house. And, so we were sitting in the driveways or not driveways, I live in the city, but like in front of houses, our opposite houses. And it was so touching though, to know that she cared that much and could hold that much that she drove to find me to make sure I was okay. Um, Whatever okay meant in that moment. And just to make sure I wasn't alone. Let's say that. Yeah. And so, yeah, I feel very blessed and grateful to um, have had these supports because I wouldn't say I'm a person who's always felt like I've had, my best friends or like there are years in my life where I'm like, who are my best friends? Like, do I have people I can call right now if somebody, if I need something, if I need to talk something through? And um, I do feel lucky in this moment to have that. And some of that also became clearer through this process, through the pandemic, through this process of losing Peter. So, um, yeah, as far as teachers, I was reading one of Malidoma Some's books. Well, I read it before Peter passed, but I was actually in the middle of one of Sobonfu Some's books when Peter passed. And I had all these sticky notes throughout the book, and I was really excited to talk to Peter about it because I knew he would get it, and have a really good conversation. I never got to because he left. But the Somes and Dagara traditions I feel very drawn to a lot of that. And that has been a guidance of sorts. And now I'm really, really feeling the wisdom from Martin Prechtel's voice on the videos I hear online, and I'm listening to him read The Smell of Rain on Dust, his book, and his voice just carries so much. So there are, other like teachers, quote unquote, out there for me. And there was just like who was there and in my life. And yeah, just feel really grateful for all of that. Um, yeah.
It's really beautiful, Amanda. And, as you're talking, you mentioned this part about, at some parts of your life, you felt like there were people to support you and other parts there weren't. I think that this concept of loneliness, I think is such a,
Yeah.
I'm wondering, like, do you think it's just a part of life, like having these moments of loneliness, even if we feel so,
Mm,
connected to we have all the friends in the world, we have love in our life. But I think, I don't know, I've been sort of ruminating about that, like this
yeah.
concept of loneliness, and
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for bringing that up. I mean, I have felt lonely most of my life, especially since my mother passed. And I think that in our culture, or our society at least, we we're taught that that loneliness, like the antidote to that, for instance, is like a partner or a spouse or something like that, or like like having a family, or there's many ways that we message what the antidote to this deep loneliness that many of us are feeling is. And then you speak to people who are married or have families, and some of them feel like they've never been more lonely in their lives. So it's not necessarily the panacea. Um, I think that loneliness is an artifact of the societies and cultures that we live in, that we used to live in indigenous community, in villages, in societies where we were known and knew others and lived and weaved our lives with them, whether or not we wanted to all the time. I'm sure there was plenty of times people did not want to be dealing with each other, but that was the container. And um and the connection and the relationship they had to place and to all the non-human species and relatives they had around them. I think there's this deep, so many of us are transplants from wherever we used to be. Even indigenous people here on the lands that I live on aren't usually living on the original lands that their people would have been living on. We're displaced and transplanted, and we don't come with our village or our community, and we have all this freedom to travel around and move wherever we want. Some of us with privilege, um, but I find people who are just constantly seeking. They're never satisfied. They always need to move another place and another place and another place. And I used to have a lot of that energy in myself too. And I think that was trying to satisfy this deep yearning for place, for community, for quenching or trying to quench some of this loneliness. And now I see for myself, it's a practice. It's a practice because we are in the society and the culture that we're in. It's a practice of choosing to belong somewhere and choosing to invest somewhere. Not saying that, moving is bad or anything like that, but just where I am right now, I'm choosing to try to invest and learn the plants and the land itself. I'm choosing to, knowing that my friends and family friend type, like my chosen family, will potentially move around because this is the society we live in, but choosing to invest in those relationships, whether they're going to be near me or further away, depending on how life takes us. But um, I I don't know exactly how we get to a place of, and again, like you said, it may not be a thing where we never stopped feeling lonely, but I think that is because of the systems that we're in. And so within that system, what can I do? And how can I come home to myself, as they say, and do that integrated into the family systems I've chosen and the land family and all of that. It's tough.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, it is. Thank you for sharing your vulnerability and honesty with us, because I think that's
Mhm.
such an important point that, a lot of people feel this way, and it's perhaps just a part of the human condition. And so, Amanda, what do you want to tell our listeners about their overall wellness and well-being? I mean, what's kind of your main takeaway, your call to action?
My call to action, like I'm a person who feels her feelings, and when I notice that I'm not feeling a feeling, I have to find a space, to make space to figure it out, to call in friends to help me hold a space for it, to go to a workshop, to go to whatever I can do to try to um, get to know that, because I think that I spent a lot of my early life not doing that, either trying to suppress feelings or run away from feelings or creating anxiety about having anxiety, or like just I wasn't didn't have a good relationship with a lot of that. And I had a lot of health problems. And so And I think a lot of that was related. I actually know it was related. And so for me, especially with grief, there's so much grief in our bodies and in the world right now, and it's only unfortunately growing. Um, and I think a lot of the grief that's growing is coming out of unprocessed, unmetabolized grief. So for me, it's like, how do we become less afraid of grief and the work that we each need to do with our grief and our emotions, and that we to do it in community, because I did a lot of my not a lot I did some of my grieving on my own in this very like um, intense way that I don't really recommend to other people. But the grieving that I did in community, it creates a field where if people, you need people who are aware of their emotions to some degree, or somebody to hold that container. Because I don't know that I could do that, for instance, in a circle of my family members. Like, we would need some strong people to hold energetic boundaries there for us. But those people exist, and I think should be sought out. um, but in the collective, we were able to um, go places that we weren't necessarily each going to go on our own, and we were able to really tap into emotions that we might have been it might not have been in a healing way or in a good way, or we would have just been too afraid, like I said. And so the collective really helps to, um, held in the right way, can really help us to move more, because I don't we're not supposed to grieve alone. Like I've mentioned, when we talk about these indigenous cultures, like, they don't grieve alone. Their 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 rituals and processes after grief involve being doing it together. And I think what we have here, and I mentioned this in that talk that you saw, is like, wakes and funerals and commemorations and memorial services. These are all really, really beautiful. And the way that they're structured, it feels like there's a lot of um, like pieces of that stem from deeper ritual, but have been reduced to like a less emotional, a less deep primal version of what it might have come from. And what I'm advocating for is like, just like we can't talk our way out of being angry, we can't talk our way out of um, feeling things. Like, it's going to be there whether or not you want to feel it. Um, I think the same is true in the grief setting. Like, we have to physically primally go there. And that is the kind of ritual that I think that we need to either reclaim from our lineages, or to learn from people who hold other lineages that have that practice still, so that we can. And I don't mean like learn to then go take and start offering,
Right.
like not appropriative ways, just like to join in humility and humbleness to for ourselves, because we need to heal.
Right.
And I really truly believe that if we can work through our unmetabolized grief and trauma, we won't we will be living in a different world. We won't have the like huge levels of grief that we're now, bombarded with every day. That we now still have now is more and more unmetabolized grief. So I just think we really need to get at what it is that drives a lot of this, and I'm really, that's my advocacy. That's the soapbox I'm going to stand on, because I
Amazing.
just really, really feel that deeply.
Yes. Yes, yes, yes. I love it. I love it. Well, amazing. I'm so grateful for you, Amanda, for your time
Mm,
today. It was just so lovely to connect.
thank you.
And where can people find your book?
Yeah, it's on the You're Going to Die website, but I think the easiest way to get to, because that's a more complicated URL, is my website, which is cronintraining.life. CRONE intraining.life, and there's an order book link that can send you over to the publisher's website for the book. And while you're on my website, some of those videos I mentioned earlier, the like animated or video based poems are there as well. Only one of which is in the book, so there's other stuff to check out. But yeah, if I've sparked anything for anyone, please go check it out.
Yes. Amazing. Thank you so much again for your time,
Yeah.
Amanda. So lovely to connect with you. And
Thank you.
just
too.
sending you many blessings.
Thank you so much.
Oh. And for our audience, thanks for joining and for listening. In this episode, we learned about how to process grief with Amanda Nagai. And you can tune in to Gateways to Awakening, where we host one-on-one conversations with leading experts in wellness, well-being, and spirituality. Thanks again.